The massive brown bear collapsed just inches from Sarah Mitchell's front door, his breathing so shallow she could barely see his chest rise and fall. Ice crystals had formed in his thick fur, and his usually powerful paws were trembling uncontrollably. Sarah stood frozen herself, her hand still on the door handle, knowing that what she did in the next 60 seconds would determine whether this magnificent creature lived or died. But this wasn't just any bear. This was the same bear that had been visiting her remote Montana cabin for 3 years, the same bear she'd named Bruno. And what happened next would change both their lives forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to catch more heartwarming stories like this one. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Let me take you back to where it all began, 3 winters ago in the heart of the Glacier National Park region. Sarah Mitchell wasn't your typical mountain woman. She was a wildlife photographer who had moved to this isolated cabin after a devastating divorce that left her questioning everything about human nature. Her nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and that's exactly how she liked it. Sarah had always been more comfortable with animals than people. Growing up on her grandfather's ranch in Wyoming, she'd learned to read the language of the wild. The tilt of a deer's head that meant danger, the way a hawk circled when it spotted prey, the subtle signs that separated a curious animal from a threatening one. Her cabin sat on 40 acres of pristine wilderness, surrounded by towering pines and a crystal-clear stream that never froze completely, even in the harshest winters. It was here, on a crisp October morning, that she first encountered Bruno. She had been sitting on her porch with her morning coffee, camera ready for the golden hour lighting, when she heard the distinctive sound of breaking branches. Through her telephoto lens, she watched as a young male brown bear emerged from the tree line about 50 yards away. He wasn't fully grown yet, probably around 3 years old and recently separated from his mother. What struck Sarah immediately wasn't his size, but his behavior. Most bears would have caught her scent and either fled or postured aggressively. But this one simply sat down at the edge of the clearing and seemed to study her with an almost human-like curiosity. For 20 minutes, they observed each other. Sarah slowly raised her camera, expecting him to bolt. Instead, he tilted his head as if posing. She captured what would become one of her most treasured photographs, a young bear with soulful brown eyes, bathed in golden morning light. She named him Bruno, after her grandfather's old German shepherd, who'd had the same intelligent, gentle eyes. Over the following months, Bruno became a regular visitor, not daily, but often enough that Sarah began to recognize his patterns. He'd appear when the salmon weren't running well in the main river, or when berry season was particularly sparse. He seemed to understand that Sarah's property was a safe haven. Sarah was careful never to feed him directly. She knew the old saying, "A fed bear is a dead bear," but she did make sure to secure her trash properly and even planted a small berry garden at the far edge of her property. Not for Bruno specifically, she told herself, but for all the wildlife that called this place home. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and distance. Bruno would forage peacefully while Sarah photographed him from her porch. Sometimes he'd nap in the sunny meadow behind her cabin, and she'd work quietly in her garden, both of them comfortable in each other's presence. The local ranger, Tom Bradley, had initially been concerned when Sarah reported the regular bear visits, but after observing Bruno's behavior himself, he admitted he'd never seen such a naturally cautious and respectful wild bear. Most bears this age are either overly aggressive as they establish territory or skittish from bad human encounters. But Bruno seems to have found a middle ground. Just be careful, Sarah. Wild animals are unpredictable, no matter how gentle they seem. As Bruno matured into a magnificent 400-pound adult, their peaceful coexistence continued. But the winter of his 6th year brought challenges unlike any Sarah had seen in her time at the cabin. Climate change had disrupted the normal patterns. The salmon runs were late and sparse. The berry crops had failed due to an unexpected late frost. And worst of all, an early blizzard in October had driven most prey animals to lower elevations, leaving the high country bear struggling to find enough food to build the fat reserves they needed for hibernation. Sarah began noticing signs of distress in the local wildlife. Deer appeared gaunt. The family of foxes that lived near her creek looked thin and desperate. And Bruno looked different when he appeared in early November. His usual confident gait had become labored. His thick coat couldn't hide the fact that he was losing weight rapidly. Instead of the healthy roundness bears should have before winter, Bruno's ribs were beginning to show. Sarah found herself lying awake at night, listening for the sound of his footsteps, worried when too many days passed without a sighting. She had started leaving small amounts of high-calorie nuts and dried fruits at the edge of her property, not feeding him directly, but providing opportunities for natural foraging. But it wasn't enough. December brought the worst blizzard Sarah had experienced since moving to Montana. For 6 days, snow fell relentlessly, accumulating to depths of over 4 feet. Her generator struggled to keep the cabin warm, and she began to worry about her own survival as her firewood supply dwindled. On the 7th day, the storm finally broke, revealing a transformed landscape. Everything was buried under a pristine but deadly blanket of white. The stream had frozen solid for the first time since she'd lived there, and there was no sign of wildlife anywhere. Sarah strapped on her snowshoes and ventured out to check her trail cameras, hoping to spot signs of the animals that had been her companions for 3 years. What she found on the memory cards made her heart sink. Image after image showed disparate wildlife struggling through the deep snow. A doe and her fawn trapped against a cliff face. The family of foxes huddled together, clearly malnourished. And Bruno. The final images of Bruno were heartbreaking. The timestamp showed they were taken just 2 days ago. Bruno appeared to be wandering aimlessly, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. In the last clear image, he was looking directly at the camera, his eyes holding an expression Sarah had never seen before: confusion, desperation, and something that looked almost like a plea for help. She checked the camera closest to her cabin. Nothing. For 2 days. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made her bolt upright, hoping to hear Bruno's familiar footsteps. But the forest was eerily silent under its blanket of snow. She made a decision that would have horrified wildlife experts, but felt right in her heart. She began leaving food closer to the cabin, high-energy provisions that could help sustain a struggling bear through the worst of winter. For 3 days, the food went untouched. On the 4th day, she woke to find the food gone, but also something else: tracks in the snow leading away from her cabin. But these weren't Bruno's usual confident prints. These were the desperate, dragging marks of an animal at the end of its strength. Sarah followed the trail for half a mile until she found where it ended, at the base of a large pine tree where Bruno had clearly tried to create a makeshift den. But the snow was too deep, the ground too frozen. Signs of his struggle were everywhere: scratch marks on the tree, disturbed snow where he'd tried and failed to dig. The trail led away again, weaving erratically through the forest. Sarah followed it with growing dread, until the tracks simply stopped, as if Bruno had collapsed and then somehow forced himself to keep moving, but the snow had covered any further trace. 3 days later, just as dawn was breaking over the snow-covered mountains, Sarah heard it, a sound that would haunt her forever. It wasn't quite a roar, wasn't quite a whimper. It was the sound of an animal giving up. She threw on her boots and coat and rushed outside, following the sound, and there, at the edge of her clearing, she saw him. Bruno had somehow made it back to the one place he'd always felt safe. But this wasn't the magnificent bear she'd known for 3 years. This was a shadow of himself, gaunt, exhausted, his beautiful coat matted with ice and snow. He was trying to walk toward her cabin, but every few steps he'd stumble and nearly fall. His breathing was labored, creating small clouds in the frigid air. And his eyes held a look Sarah recognized from her own darkest moments, the look of someone who had fought as hard as they could but was ready to surrender. That's when Bruno collapsed, just 10 feet from her front door. Sarah stood frozen, her mind racing through everything she'd learned about bear behavior, wildlife protocol, and common sense. Everything told her to stay back, call the rangers, let nature take its course. But as she watched this magnificent creature struggling to breathe, she realized that sometimes the rules don't matter. Sometimes love, yes, love, demands that you risk everything for another being's life. Sarah opened her door wide and stepped back. Come on, Bruno. If you're going to die, you're not going to die alone in the cold. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with what must have been the last of his strength, Bruno raised his head and looked at her. Their eyes met across those 10 feet of snow, and Sarah swore she saw understanding pass between them. Using his front paws, Bruno dragged himself forward, inch by agonizing inch, until he reached her doorway. Sarah had moved her furniture back, creating as much space as possible in her small cabin. Bruno pulled himself inside and immediately collapsed on the large rug in front of her fireplace. What happened next was the most surreal and beautiful night of Sarah's life. For the first hour, Sarah simply sat in her kitchen watching Bruno breathe. She'd called Tom Bradley, the ranger, but the roads were impassable and wouldn't be clear for at least 2 days. She was on her own with a nearly dead grizzly bear in her living room. Gradually, as the warmth from the fire began to penetrate his thick fur, Bruno's breathing became less labored. Sarah prepared a mixture of honey, water, and salmon she'd been saving for a special occasion. If this wasn't special, nothing was. She placed the food within Bruno's reach and retreated to her bedroom doorway. For several hours, Bruno didn't move. Then, slowly, he raised his head and began to eat. Throughout the night, Sarah dozed fitfully in her bedroom, waking every hour to check on her enormous houseguest. Each time, Bruno seemed a little stronger. By morning, he was able to lift his head without effort, and his eyes had regained some of their old intelligence. Over the next 3 days, while they waited for the ranger to arrive, Sarah witnessed something she never could have imagined. Bruno wasn't just recovering physically, he was showing her a side of wild bears that few humans ever see. He was incredibly gentle and aware of his size in the small space. When he needed to move, he did so carefully, never knocking over furniture or threatening Sarah's space. When she brought him food and water, he would wait until she'd moved away before approaching the bowls. Most incredibly, he seemed to understand that this was temporary. He wasn't trying to claim territory or show dominance. He was simply accepting the gift of warmth and safety that Sarah was offering.
On the second night, as Sarah sat reading by the fire with Bruno sleeping nearby, she realized something profound was happening. For 3 years, they'd maintained respectful distance. But now, sharing this small space during Bruno's most vulnerable moment, the walls between wild and human had dissolved. This wasn't about taming a wild animal or forming an inappropriate bond. This was about two beings, each alone in their own way, recognizing their shared need for compassion and companionship. When Tom Bradley finally arrived on Snowmobile, he expected to find either a disaster or a dead bear. Instead, he found Sarah sitting calmly at her kitchen table while a very much alive Bruno rested peacefully by the fire. In 30 years, as a ranger, Tom would later tell his colleagues, "I've never seen anything like it. That bear knew exactly where he was and who had saved him. There was no aggression, no territorial behavior, just gratitude." Tom examined Bruno and confirmed what Sarah suspected. He was severely malnourished, but no longer in immediate danger. The question now was what to do next. Standard protocol would be to tranquilize Bruno and relocate him, but that presented problems. He was still too weak for the stress of relocation, and with the food shortage continuing throughout the region, moving him might just delay the inevitable. Tom made a decision that would raise eyebrows at the state wildlife office, but probably saved Bruno's life. He would allow Bruno to remain in the area, with Sarah providing supplemental feeding under official oversight, until spring arrived and natural food sources recovered. What followed was the most extraordinary winter of Sarah's life. Bruno didn't stay in the cabin. That had been a one-time emergency arrangement. But he did establish a den in a snow cave just 50 yards from her door, close enough that she could monitor his condition while still allowing him to remain wild. Every morning, Sarah would leave high-energy food at a designated spot halfway between the cabin and Bruno's den. Every evening, she'd photograph him from her window, documenting his gradual recovery for Tom's reports. But it was more than just feeding. Sarah began to understand that she and Bruno had formed something unprecedented, a partnership based on mutual trust and respect. Bruno seemed to understand that Sarah's property was now officially under his protection. Several times during the winter, she woke to find his tracks circling her cabin, and twice she saw him chase away other bears that had wandered too close. In return, Sarah became Bruno's advocate with the outside world. When state wildlife officials expressed concern about the arrangement, she provided detailed documentation showing that Bruno was regaining health while remaining completely wild in his behavior. When spring finally arrived in late April, the transformation was complete. Bruno had not only recovered his full weight, but had grown into what Tom called the most magnificent specimen I've ever seen in these mountains.
The salmon runs returned to normal. Berry bushes budded early after the late snow provided excellent moisture. And Bruno began expanding his range again, leaving for days at a time to explore territories he'd been too weak to defend during the winter. Sarah knew their partnership was coming to an end, and she was ready for it. She'd gotten what she didn't even know she needed: proof that the capacity for compassion could bridge any gap, even between human and wild bear. But Bruno wasn't quite ready to say goodbye. On a warm May morning, as Sarah worked in her garden, she heard familiar footsteps approaching. Bruno emerged from the tree line, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, maintaining a cautious distance, were 2 yearling cubs. Sarah's heart nearly stopped.
This was Bruno's way of introducing his family, the ultimate sign of trust in the animal kingdom. For several minutes, the little family foraged at the edge of her property while Sarah watched in amazement. The cubs were curious about this human their father clearly trusted, but they maintained the appropriate wild distance. Bruno, meanwhile, seemed to be teaching them about boundaries, about which spaces were safe and which were not. Before leaving, Bruno did something that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. He walked to the exact spot where she'd been leaving food all winter, sat down, and looked directly at her. For 30 seconds, they held eye contact across the meadow. Then Bruno stood, gathered his cubs with a low woof, and disappeared into the forest. That was 3 years ago. Bruno still visits Sarah's property, but now it's different. He comes as a wild bear who happens to have a profound respect for this particular human and her space. He's never again needed rescue, but the bond they forged during that desperate winter remains unbroken. Sarah has documented their story through hundreds of photographs and detailed journals that are now being studied by wildlife behaviorists across the country. Her work is helping scientists better understand the complex emotional lives of bears and the possibilities for coexistence between humans and wildlife. She's also become an advocate for wildlife conservation, speaking at conferences and writing articles about the importance of preserving habitat and understanding animal behavior. The cabin that was once her refuge from the world has become a research station where she hosts visiting scientists and photographers. But more importantly, Sarah has learned something profound about the nature of love and compassion. That winter with Bruno taught her that the capacity for caring doesn't diminish when it crosses species lines. It expands. Bruno's story isn't just about one woman and one bear. It's about the choices we make when faced with suffering, whether that suffering belongs to a human, an animal, or any living being in distress. Sarah could have followed protocol. She could have stayed safe inside her cabin and let nature take its course. But she chose compassion over caution, love over fear, and that choice saved a life while transforming her own. In our world of increasing isolation and division, Bruno's story reminds us that connection is still possible, that trust can be built even across the vast differences between species, that sometimes the most profound relationships are built not on similarity, but on mutual recognition of vulnerability and strength. Just last month, Sarah sent me an update. Bruno, now 10 years old, is the dominant male in a territory spanning nearly 50 square miles. He's been seen with various female bears over the years, and Sarah believes he's likely the father of several cubs in the region. More importantly, he's become what researchers call an ambassador bear, an animal whose behavior helps other bears in the area learn to coexist peacefully with the small human community in the region. Bear-human conflicts in Sarah's area have dropped by 80% since Bruno established his territory. Sarah, now 52, has never remarried, but she says she's never been happier. She's found her calling in wildlife photography and conservation, and she's found her purpose in being a bridge between the human and natural worlds. And every winter, when the snow gets deep and the nights get long, Sarah still keeps extra food in her pantry and watches the tree line at dawn, just in case another desperate soul needs a warm place to heal. Bruno and Sarah's story reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary relationships begin with the simplest act of opening a door, literally and figuratively, to someone in need. In your own life, you might not encounter a frozen bear, but you will encounter beings, human and animal, who need compassion, who need someone to choose love over fear, understanding over judgment. The question is, when that moment comes, will you open your door? If this story touched your heart, please share it with others who need to be reminded of the power of compassion. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of the bonds between humans and the wild world around us. And remember, in a world that can sometimes feel cold and isolated, we all have the power to be someone's warm door in the storm.